So everyone take approximately like no more than 10 bills in there. And if they're still left over, then just take more until it's of anything. Just take 10 and then pass it around. Okay, now that everyone's got their icebreakers, here's what's going to happen. So actually, let me start off with welcome to Ratio Christi. So as you know, we are a Christian apologetics group, and Ratio Christi means reasons for Christ. And so we're going to start off with a series finale in my How I Became Unwoke series. And to start things off, we're going to do, actually I'm going to switch us to the slide that explains the icebreaker that we are doing. Okay, this was designed with a coin flip portion, but I did not bring that, so instead we're going to change that up a little. First off, take your collection of Monopoly money, and then instead of a coin toss, you're going to do rock, paper, scissors against one person nearest to you who doesn't have a partner to go up against. And it's basically whoever is the first one to get a win. That's about it. Once you win, everyone's going to be doing it, so we're just going to do rock, paper, scissors. So whoever gets the first win, and here's the catch, though. Whoever no, you're not doing that. You're not doing that. Here's what you're doing. Whoever wins the rock, paper, scissors duel, the loser gives whatever the highest Monopoly bill they have to the winner. So automatically, whatever your highest bill is goes to the winner. So if you have, the highest you have is a 500 and you lose, give it to the winner. And we're going to repeat. And then once you do that, you go up against someone you haven't gone up before. And you basically repeat this with as many people at your table. And it's going to be a time limit that I will be monitoring. We're going to do this for, let's say, 3 minutes. And then after that, there's going to be a special, let's say, advantage that applies to whoever has the most at the end out of your entire table group, okay? So once all of you are gathered back at the table, we're going to start this little icebreaker game. So, So it'll make sense a lot later. So everyone ready? Everyone ready? Everyone understand the rules of the icebreaker?
Let's all loan him one bill.
All right, here we go. Is everybody ready to go?
We'll all loan him some money.
Yeah, Ray does no money.
And I loan with interest.
All right, we're going to go. Ready, your rock, paper, scissors duel in 3, 2, 1.
I don't know who I'm doing it with.
Whoever you haven't met yet or worked with.
Who's this guy?
So you two, go.
2, 3. Everybody else is started.
Yes! Yes!
10 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, time. Okay, I'll give you a couple seconds to count your total that you have as individuals.
This is proof of what's that thing they call it?
I don't know.
Like when you star with more money.
Okay, we'll get into that interestingly. All right, does everyone know what their total is?
This is an argument for reparations.
I only have like 180. Probably have like 70 so.
Okay, keep that number in your memory. We're going to apply that later. Okay, so if everyone's got their totals ready, we can get into the special bonus detail. By a show of hands, who has, let's say, over 100? Raise your hand.
Hello.
Okay, raise your hand if you have over 500.
Hello.
Raise your hand if you have over 800. Over 1,000. Over 1,500. 2,000 or more. Ooh, 3,000 or more. Okay, so keep your hand up, John. Who has less than 100? Out of curiosity. You're the only one? Okay, so we're gonna. So John. No, John, you're gonna pay a lot more than that. I want you to take, since you have the most and he has the least, I want you to take all but one of your bills and give it to Shri right now. And that's in order. Give all but one to him.
There you go.
That too. Shrey gets that too. Okay, who?
Wait, who gives you the power to order that?
Because I said so. All right, we would do a second round, but for the sake of time, I'm going to call my slide pusher to come join me at the desk. And then you can put the bills in the center. Just put them in the center, and I'll gather them up later.
She's a pusher.
Okay, while Sierra's getting ready, like, how was the game, Icebreaker, out of curiosity? You can just say out loud. The Icebreaker, how did y'all like that, out of curiosity?
It was cool. I got too confident at the beginning and I started losing.
Oh, yeah?
I realize people don't understand the rules.
I did.
It's on 3.
How did anyone feel about the twist towards the end?
Right, it's rock, paper, scissors.
How did I feel about you taking all my money and giving it to this guy?
I didn't take all of it. I took a portion.
Now here's the thing.
Amazing!
Before you even told me or commanded me to give him, I was donating to his cause. Yeah. Without you commanding.
Okay, so,
I'm a good guy.
all right, so with that in mind, we can officially get to my official presentation. Now, the reason we went with, part of why I decided to go with this particular icebreaker is to get at the topic that's going to be addressed later, the topic of income equality. So, as we go to the next slide, this is inspired by a book that's had a very big influence on me called Discrimination and Disparities by Sowell. And we can actually get into the PowerPoints, the video explaining who he is. And then we can get into his book, and then we can get into the topic of discrimination and disparities as he talks about it. And then the icebreaker will come into play later. So let's roll it.
He's an economist, a historian, a philosopher, and one of the greatest social theorists America has ever produced. In a career spanning 6 decades, he's published more than 40 books and written thousands of newspaper columns on topics ranging from economic history and political philosophy to social inequality, education, and race. His name is Thomas Sowell, and he might be the most important scholar you've never heard of. Born during the Great Depression in rural North Carolina, in a home with no electricity, Sowell was orphaned when he was just a toddler. Taken in by a distant relative, he grew up in New York City's Harlem neighborhood. An unruly teen, he was obviously intelligent and obviously full of anger. The latter initially overwhelmed the former. He dropped out of high school, left home at age 17, and lived in a shelter for homeless boys, where he kept a knife under his pillow at night for protection. The Marines saved him. It wasn't by choice. He was drafted during the Korean War. In the military, he gained habits of personal discipline and developed self-control. He taught pistol shooting and learned photography, which became a lifelong hobby. After leaving the Marines, he went to college on the GI Bill, eventually graduating from Harvard and doing additional studies at the University of Chicago under the guidance of the legendary economist Milton Friedman. He began his intellectual journey as a committed Marxist, but soon reached a life-altering conclusion. Marxism didn't work. After studying the effects of various government regulations, including minimum wage laws, he concluded that free markets were a far better alternative, particularly for disadvantaged groups. Many attempts at redistributing wealth, he later wrote, have ended up redistributing poverty. In the 1960s and 70s, Sowell taught economics at Amherst, Cornell, and UCLA, distinguishing himself as one of the country's top experts on economic history. Since 1980, he's been a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. It was around this time that Sowell turned his attention to social theory and political philosophy, writing books like Knowledge and Decisions and A Conflict of Visions, which many consider to be his best professional work. He also began writing more about racial controversies, which is why he's not as well known and appreciated today as he should be. Sowell has been a vocal critic of civil rights leaders and of liberalism's misguided efforts to help the Black poor. His targets over the decades have included welfare programs, racial preferences, multiculturalism, and opposition to school choice. Sowell brings the same empirical approach to writing about social policy that he brings to writing about economics. His focus is on the facts and the evidence. The actual results of a policy matter much more to him than the good intentions of politicians and policymakers. This is perfectly captured in his concept of stage one thinking. Liberal politicians propose expensive policy solutions and never ask the only questions that really matter. What are the long-term costs and consequences? In other words, what happens beyond stage one? By the time these costs and consequences fully manifest themselves, and they're usually disastrous, the politicians who originally set the policies in motion are long gone. They've derived all the political benefit and paid none of the cost. In books like Race and Culture, Sowell has demonstrated racial preferences are counterproductive, that political power is not necessary to advance economically, and that racial discrimination cannot be used as a blanket explanation for disparities in employment, education, and income. He's also shown how a racial or ethnic group's self-development, acquiring certain attitudes and behaviors, has far more bearing on economic advancement than how a group is treated by society at large. The Chinese in Malaysia and the Jews in Eastern Europe are among many examples of minority groups who have risen economically despite being the targets of bias and discrimination. To those who use racism as an all-purpose explanation for racial inequality, Sowell's views have made him a pariah. Unable to counter his rigorous, evidence-based scholarship, left-leaning intellectuals, political activists, and mainstream media prefer to ignore him. That's why so many people today are aware of names like Ta-Nehisi Coates, Ibram X. Kendi, and Cornel West, but not Thomas Sowell. To say that Sowell has not had the impact he should is not the same as saying he has not had a profound impact on the thinking of a vast number of people. A fan account on Twitter has more than 700,000 followers. Videos of him on YouTube have millions of views. Mention his name to any conservative, and you'll hear Sowell spoken of in reverential terms. Indeed, he matters today more than ever. That's because we're still debating topics he's written volumes about, like social justice, slavery reparations, and critical race theory. And Sowell matters because he's that rarest of species, a brave and honest intellectual. We need 100 more just like him. I'm Jason Riley, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and author of Maverick, a biography of Thomas Sowell, for Prager University.
So with that, that's who Tom Sowell is. And once we go to the next slide, we can go into one of the last book in this series that made a huge impact on me, Discrimination and Disparities by Tom Sowell. So first off, we're going to start off going piece by piece as a little bit of an overview. One of the topics he covers, as you can tell, is discrimination, which is what we're going to start with. And with discrimination, it has a negative connotation for a lot of reasons. But with Tom Sowell, when he did his research for the book, looks at two specific categories to explain the different types of discrimination. The first one, classified as discrimination 1, is referring to what I meant making a subcategory, judging each person as an individual regardless of what group that person is a part of. So one way to look at that is the context of a job interview, where you're interviewed as an individual based off your qualifications and your experience, field relevancy, et cetera, et cetera. Discrimination 2, the part that most people usually are familiar with, is the one referring to treating people negatively based on arbitrary aversions or animosities to individuals of a particular race or sex, et cetera, et cetera. That's where we get the idea when we hear discrimination, racism or sexism. Now, before we go to the next slide, the third thing that he details in the book is each of these different categories of discrimination have a big thing in common, which is the cost of making one decision over the other. Specifically, how high the cost is for making a specific discriminatory decision, as well as who pays the cost. And as we get into the next slide, he breaks down discrimination 1 into 2 other categories, sticking with the concept of who's going to pay the price for making one decision over the other, not just in terms of money, but also in terms of overall consequences for that specific decision. So in this context, discrimination 1 is broken down into discrimination 1A and B. So to put this in work experience kind of scenario, Of course, we know the example of racially based discrimination of I'm not hiring this person because of their race or their sex or blah, blah, blah. That's the common one we know of. As far as 1A, it brings up one way that discrimination 1 can be done, which is you can either pay the cost in order to gain all the information you need, in order to judge each individual in your application pool, regardless of the group they belong to. That's including paying time in terms of, you're paying in terms of time, money, skills, and that adds up pretty quickly. And then the second option is where individuals are judged by empirical evidence on the group they are a part of. So B basically refers to what a lot of employers do where they filter out which applicants they will and will not consider. Easiest example being the groups that only have a high school diploma get filtered out, groups with a bachelor's get filtered out, people with the bachelor's and say 6 years of experience, and so on and so forth. Then you narrow it down to say 3 of the top applicants, and then you can maybe afford to do discrimination 1A. Now he backs this up with several other examples of businesses in say South Africa where discrimination 2 was used very often. However, the employers that used discrimination 1 were able to undermine apartheid as it was going on, because for them, Tom Sowell summed it up in a quote that I found very helpful. Races may prefer one race over the other, but they prefer themselves over everybody else. So basically the idea of self-interest takes priority over racial preferences when the going gets tough and your business is on the line. And he backs this up with other economic and historical instances where the two were pitted up against each other, and the people making those decisions paid the price for them. So as we go to the next slide, this is an important rule that was emphasized in the book, and this is a Thomas Sowell quote that goes to the effect of, quote, "It is hard to imagine a more stupid or more dangerous way of making decisions than by putting those decisions in the hands of people who pay no price for being wrong," end quote. So in that example, for those who read my first talk, when I brought up the topic of should governments interfere in this marginalized group or in this marginalized group, I responded with the same idea here, which is that if this individual, say in the government, is not willing to pay the price for being wrong, then my answer would be no. So that's a personal example of that rule in action. So as we go to the next slide, he then covers disparities, and a common definition of disparities when it's used, for the most part, is referring to equality or differences in results/outcomes. And basically, the quote up here by Fernand Braudel addresses the topic of disparities, especially when you hear economic disparities or racial disparities, et cetera, especially when you have one group that refers to America as being a systemically racist nation because of said racial disparities. This quote up here by Fernand addresses a question that I ask often in my head, and he basically goes, quote, "In no society have all regions and all parts of the population developed equally," end quote. So what he's getting at is that essentially disparities or a difference in results are about as natural as nature is, because we are individuals with different skill sets, preferences, personalities, values, etc. And these are the different definitions of equality that are usually brought up when people bring up equity, usually as a common phrase. There's equality under the law, then there's equal opportunities, and then there's equal results. And then we'll get into those in the next slide.
I don't know, maybe you're going to address this, but...
We'll address it in the Q&A.
Okay.
Yep, remind me about it later. The next part is on the Marxist lie around income inequality, and that's going back to income disparities. The first one, or the first Marxist lie that's common in a lot of woke circles, is Marxism assumes that the differences in economic results are because of exploitation. However, Marxism does not test that against reality. And then it also assumes that if we got rid of the capitalists in different communist countries, that the living standards of the workers would be equal to the level of the workers in capitalist countries or higher. The result ended up being that's not what happened. In every communist country that's attempted Marxism, regardless of their cultural differences, the same outcome happened every time, which was that their conditions got worse. So with that, we're gonna watch a 5-minute video that's yellow linked on income inequality as a counter-argument for being good.
There's been a lot said and a lot written about income inequality, about how unfair it is that a few people are very rich and the rest of us aren't, that the income gap between the wealthy and even the middle class, let alone the poor, is so large. There's only one problem with this complaint. It's wrong. Income inequality is actually a good thing when it's the product of a free market economy, and your own life proves it. An economy is made up of millions of individuals making decisions about their own lives, where and how much they want to work, what they want to buy, and so on. You are one of those individuals. In a country like the United States, you are free to pursue a path in life that you believe best suits your talents. That talent might be teaching, or making music, or banking, or starting a small business, or raising a family. Whatever it is, this freedom helps to make life enjoyable, exciting, and meaningful. But it's also an expression of inequality. This is simply because we're all different. We have different talents, different temperaments, different ambitions. That's okay because, again, in a free society, we can seek out opportunities that play to our personal strengths, that distinguish us from others. If you find what you're really good at and work hard, you might have great success and make a lot of money. If you're an outstanding athlete, I'll buy a ticket to see you play. If you're a savvy investor, I'll give you some of my money to invest. As long as you have the freedom to guide your own destiny, you have a chance to reach your full potential, achieving success however you define it. But if someone, say a government bureaucrat, told you that your ambition had limits, that there was a ceiling above which you could not rise, I doubt you'd be happy about it. You'd feel like you were in a straitjacket. Forced equality means less opportunity to pursue what makes you individually great. But what about the growing gap between the rich, the 1%, and the rest of us, the 99% that one hears so much about? Isn't that a bad thing? Again, the answer is no. Here's why. In a free market economy, people become wealthy, making what the rich enjoy today into something almost everybody can enjoy tomorrow. The rich are the test buyers. Consider the cell phone. Now we all have them, but when Motorola manufactured the first one in 1983, it was the size of a brick, had a half-hour battery life, reception was terrible, and calls were very expensive. It cost $4,000. But if no one had bought that $4,000 brick, there wouldn't be a $40 cell phone today. In the 1960s, a computer cost over $1 million. Nowadays, thanks to billionaires like Michael Dell, we have incredibly advanced computers that cost us a few $100s. Remember what an out-of-reach luxury flat-screen TVs once were? Only the rich could afford them. Today, your living room is essentially your own private cinema. The free market is about turning scarcity into abundance. What was once available to the few is now available to the many. Wealth inequality is an important corollary to that truth. So, should I resent the people who became wealthy because they have more money than I do? Or should I be grateful for the economic system that allows them to enrich my life and the lives of millions of other people? This feature of the free market, income inequality, can appear terribly unfair. But with a little further investigation, the real picture becomes clear. Income inequality makes what once seemed like impossible luxuries available to almost everyone. It provides the incentive for creative people to gamble on new ideas. It promotes personal freedom and rewards hard work, talent, and achievement. In sum, income inequality signals that individual liberty, opportunity, and innovation are all present in a free economy. Pretty good for something that's supposed to be so bad. 2 final points. The 1% Club is always open to new members, and you don't have to be in the top 1% to have a very good life. And that, not the existence of the very wealthy, is what matters most. I'm John Tamney, editor of Real Clear Markets for Prager University.
So now we can get to the next slide. And then we're going to get into the Marxist lies around social justice. So looking forward to when we get to the Q&A on that, but basically one of the more unifying definitions, which has room for improvement, is one way to look at it is justice for marginalized groups of people. And these are the three usual assumptions that are usually there around when talking about social justice. I'll go with just the first one, which is the assumption that various groups would be equally successful if biased treatment were eliminated entirely. So another way of phrasing that would be the assumption that, for example, my community, the Black community, if you were to erase racism from the hearts and minds of every single human being, then our problems in whatever the problems are in our communities would disappear altogether. So Tom Sowell does not agree with that conclusion, and I don't agree with it either, because again, when you take into a community's shared strengths, talents, values, and culture, the most likely the problems are going to stay there unless the culture changes by a lot, or the skill sets that enter in that community change by a lot. So then with that, we can get to the next slide. And then there should be one last video, but before we get to that, this will get into the cultural apologetics portion. So to get ready to wrap things up, the first Bible supports social justice argument I've heard is usually that God pursues social justice for different groups in the Bible. Hence, examples such as racial justice, economic justice, referring to the Jubilee practice that was done in Israel. And then some have actually argued for environmental justice as well. And then before we get to the video, rather than me talk about it, I have one more 5-minute video by another Christian influencer and cultural apologist named Allie Beth Stuckey. She's had a lot of time to study that question regarding the Bible. So we're going to see her video, and this is going to be the last one.
The Lord is a God of social justice. That's the message in many, maybe most, churches and synagogues in America and the West today. But here's the problem. The Bible doesn't actually say that. It says in Isaiah, the Lord is a God of justice. You'll find a lot of references to justice in the Bible, but you'll never find it preceded by the word social. But you're probably thinking, what's the difference? Isn't God the God of justice and social justice? Well, not if he's consistent. You see, God cannot be the God of justice and social justice because social justice is not just. Justice is getting what you deserve without favor. Social justice is getting what you don't deserve because you are favored. Justice is blind. Social justice is not. Let's say a man robs a store. Justice demands but one thing, that he be tried in a court of justice and, if he is found guilty, punished. That is not how social justice works. Social justice doesn't only ask if the person is guilty. It asks about his economic condition. Is he poor or wealthy? About his upbringing. What kind of childhood did he have? About his race or ethnicity. Is he a member of a group that has been historically oppressed? Justice demands that everyone be equal under the law. Social justice demands that everyone be equal, period. Economically, socially, and in every other possible way. Justice asks, who did it? Social justice asks, why did he do it? Lost in all these social justice considerations is the individual's own responsibility for what he did. That's why social justice advocates have abandoned the term justice. They deem justice alone as unfair. And sometimes it is. A man who was beaten by his father and abandoned by his mother is more likely to commit a violent crime than a man raised in a loving home. But those facts cannot and should not determine his innocence or guilt. Why? Because justice is first and foremost about truth. Is the person guilty or innocent of the crime? None of us is omniscient. We don't know why people do what they do. After all, the vast majority of people raised in abusive homes do not commit violent crimes, nor do the vast majority of people who are members of an historically oppressed group. Being a victim, however that is defined, is no excuse for hurting other people. And what about those who are hurt, the victims of those crimes? Shouldn't they and other law-abiding citizens be society's first consideration? Social justice advocates say no. They say we need social justice to even things out, and that means favoring the have-nots over the haves, the poor over the rich, the female over the male, and the brown or black over the white. The Bible does not see the world this way. In fact, it speaks against it in very explicit terms. Here's a law in the book of Exodus. Do not pervert justice by siding with the crowd, and do not show favoritism to a poor person in a lawsuit. Here's one in Leviticus. Do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor justly. Moses, the greatest lawgiver in history, declares in Deuteronomy, follow justice and justice alone. And the New Testament declares in the book of Romans, God shows no partiality. None of this means that there is no place for compassion in a system of justice. Of course there is. The Bible is preoccupied with the protection of the widow, the orphan, and unfortunate. But compassion follows justice. It doesn't precede it. Also, justice in and of itself is compassionate. First to the victims of crime and to their loved ones, and second to the criminal. How can you become a better human being if you don't first recognize that you've done something wrong? That's why anytime we put an adjective before the word justice, we no longer have justice. Economic justice, racial justice, environmental justice, any form of social justice which seeks to correct actual justice undermines justice. So then, if social justice is not a biblical concept, why do so many churches and synagogues promote it? Because many Christians and Jews no longer regard biblical principles as binding. Because it's a lot easier to dispense compassion than hold people to a biblical standard. And because leftism has superseded the Bible in many houses of worship. And leftism, as a guiding principle, holds that the weak are good and the powerful are bad. That's why the great battle of our time is between Judeo-Christian values and leftist values. The former is rooted in justice. The latter is not. I'm Allie Beth Stuckey, host of Relatable on Blaze TV for Prager University.
All right, so before we get into the Q&A and people can do devil's advocate or just question me or voice dissenting opinion, I wanted to end this with one, a thank you for attending for this series and hearing more of my story in depth. And also, hopefully you learned more about these authors, their views, and in an ideal scenario, you had a chance to purchase their work and read for yourselves and come to your own conclusions or fact check them if you wanted to. And with that, I wanted to say thank you again for attending and happy to take your questions in Q&A. Okay. Any questions? John, you said you may have had something?
Well, it just seemed like in the start, and maybe I missed it, but he said his whole basis of his book is that he based it on actual results, long-term results, not short-term, right?
Right.
What are those long-term results? I guess I didn't see the facts.
Okay.
I'm sure they're in the book, maybe, but like, what are the long-term effects of racial justice, economic justice, environmental justice? Not in a communist, Marxist sense, but even in America.
In America?
Yeah.
Okay, so one of them that he talks about extensively has to do with, for economic justice, regarding the minimum wage laws. So the basis of the minimum wage laws was designed with the intention of protecting workers, laborers from being exploited and protecting their wages. What the lawmakers at the time did not take into account was that employers have a finite amount of money that they can afford to pay their workers for whatever they're doing. So basically what the minimum wage law actually did in the long term was it actually caused employers to have to, one, lay off a lot of workers, because if you raise the minimum wage from what they could afford to what they now can't afford, usually, you know the old saying, like, last one in, first one out when going gets tough. So that's one example of the long-term consequences of minimum wage law, was that yes, it did increase the minimum wage of the different workers in whatever industries. However, it put up an extra barrier to entry for, say, people fresh out of high school who want to enter the workforce, gain skills so they can leverage for a higher paying job in the future. And then he actually was working for the Department of Labor when he found that out, and they basically told him he was looking into Puerto Rico at the time, but that's where he first found out about it. So that's one example. Any other follow-up questions?
Well, it seems like right now what's happening is the wages are sailing up, and it's not because of the law. I don't think they've raised the minimum wage, have they, recently? But all the wages are going up.
In the state of
McDonald's
Michigan?
is 15 an hour now. That was never up.
Michigan's, so as far as McDonald's, they've been reported in the news that they're getting ready to automate a lot of jobs that they used to require like 7 people in one McDonald's. Now it's down to, last time I was there, like maybe 3 people, 4 people at the most. Partly because our economy is going the way it is, and the other part of it is partly because of the long-term consequences of the minimum wage law. So there is still a barrier to entry. So a lot of high schoolers are going to have a harder time, say, working at McDonald's and learning practical skills like how to show up on time, how to be detail-oriented, communication, finances with the register in retail, et cetera, et cetera. Any other Q&As? Oh, yeah? What's your name?
Sam.
Sam, good to meet you.
In terms of the video where you talk about income inequality being a good thing, I was thinking about this a little bit. Like, for example, the means in which certain people have gotten rich on the profit. So, for example, I don't know if you know about the whole OxyContin and how it was sold as a means of like a pain relief back in the day. It was, especially in the pharmaceutical community, pharmaceutical industry, was sold as a painkiller, but then they started finding.
Then we had the opioid epidemic.
The opioid epidemic, yeah, where it became a lot more addictive. But the means in which they sold it was for a means of profit. It's not too, I guess in this terms, ethical to say that this is, I guess, the right means of, gaining some income in that sense, where people were actually depending on the drug for basically sustaining themselves.
So interesting you brought that up. So one of the things about like the pharmaceutical industry, that's probably one of the more heavily regulated industries by the government. And during that period that the opioid epidemic was unveiled, the pharmacy industry was even more regulated than before. So one of the things Tom Sowell talks about as a long-term consequence is that as the government regulates an industry more and more, it creates more barriers to entry for competitors to come in. And when you have situations where basically if I don't like this option, there's 10 other options ready to offer a better deal and whatever and so on and so forth. But with the pharmacy industry, there's like maybe the big 3, and it's hard to challenge them as a startup because there's just a laundry list of regulations keeping the newer competition out. So as far as the opioid epidemic, it changed the incentives to where it keeps the big pharma in power and position and keeps challengers out of it. So as far as the opioid epidemic, I've landed on the conclusion that that was a result of the government stepping in where they shouldn't have. And one example is the veterinary industry here in Michigan. It's mostly unregulated. And when I took my dog for vet visits, my dog had more affordable health care than even I have. So that's another example right there.
I was going to say my dad works for a pharmaceutical company. That's it was a startup, more or less, I guess you'd call it. And it's also tied to a nonprofit where the profits from the pharmaceutical company go towards this nonprofit that then disseminates epilepsy medication around the world. And but to your point, he's as I've heard from him, it's like it takes like you're waiting for 2 years for like your medication to pass FDA overview, and it also costs, I want to say millions just to like go through that process and all that stuff. Like, it's crazy. It's one of those things where like if you don't start rich, or if you don't start with like a ton of money, because it's so regulated, like breaking into that is like extremely difficult.
Right.
So it hinders that competition. Just to your point from seeing my dad in it. So.
Well, it seems to me, in response to Sam's question, well, I'm trying to actually hear what you were asking, but one of the principles of conservatism is not, well, let me back up. One of the biblical principles / conservatism is not that any way of making money is fine, right? Some ways of making money are fine and good. Some ways are evil of making money, according to biblical standards of morality. So, certain products are bad to profit from.
Right.
But there's another principle, it seems to me, like, I'm not sure if this was addressed, that, so I wonder, is there such a thing as charging too much for something and then it becomes evil to overcharge for something that should be so much more affordable? Is that part of your question?
Okay.
For example, like insulin used to be free, used to be a means for diabetic children, especially when it was first made. It was given out freely for children who were found to be diabetic, especially there was an endocrinologist, I believe. And then when somebody patented it over, now we have it being like 200 or 700. I don't even remember how much it is, but I know it's very costly. People literally need it to live, and they're dependent on these industries to kind of, provide it for them. I remember working in my anecdotal experience, working for a hospital, and then just hearing the calls about people kind of going, I can't afford this, or my insurance can't afford this. Can we switch this insulin provider to this one? And it's just like, they're trying to or they can't do that, and they need the medicine that bad.
The question was, is there a...
I guess it's more
Good
towards the income inequality problem, because there's a lot of things where it's the cost of living nowadays is almost unaffordable, like not very affordable to people around. For example, how gas is. I guess the point is more in terms of towards the income we're talking about. I know I'm circling around the income inequality question, but
I can definitely answer the question regarding the prices.
Yeah.
So in a mostly free market economy situation, the way prices actually work is usually the seller has the cost of making whatever the product or service is, and they have to either you either lose money or you break even or you make a profit, meaning you have surplus or whatever. On the other hand, as me, the consumer or the buyer, I'm doing that same thing where I am telling this person by voting with my money, saying I'm not going to pay, taking bread, for example, a food that people have proven they can't survive without because it's so essential. So I can say to this one bread seller, I'm not going to pay this amount because this is outside my cost of being able to do business with you, but there's 10 other options that are selling it for a much cheaper price at the same quality. So then in order for the vendor to make, or the seller to make a profit and stay in business, he has to serve me, and that by exchange, I'm serving him as well. And it has to be a mutually beneficial relationship, which in a free market situation, that's how prices usually work. Where it goes downhill is when an industry gets regulated to the point where the person selling knows that, well, I'm the only game in town, and it's too expensive for newer people to step in. So therefore I can charge higher and my costs are higher to stay in compliant with all these different laws. That's why, for example, like buying bread in, say, California is going to look significantly different versus in Florida or Tennessee, because Tennessee is mostly, it has a more free market view on how they treat the businesses, where California is as far into regulating people as much as possible. So does that kind of at least semi-answer your question more?
I mean, we can talk about buyers and sellers and the amount of free options for bread, but at the end of the day, the people who are buying that bread, the purpose of it is to feed family. So when you kind of control that means of doing so, you're kind of left with, by whatever means that you offer, the only playing cards is whatever you're offering, if that makes sense.
Well, in the final point before I give someone else a chance to do their question, with free markets, it's mutually holding each other accountable as well. So in free market, the buyer can't exploit me if I have the option to walk away. And so in that way, I'm punishing that person's behavior with my freedom of association. Where the predatory behavior comes in, especially when it comes to insulin or like EpiPens, those scenarios usually happen when the industry knows they can take advantage of government regulations, especially when it comes to lobbying.
I was gonna say, it's final thing. It kind of like sounds like you're just kind of, the only other option is you're free to starve.
So what do you think is a better alternative before I move to the next question?
It's not that it's these people who are supplying these things, are bad, or these, or how it says the other point, tangent point about assigning politics to the Bible as a means of saying whether it's right or wrong. My understanding of it is no different than how people used to live before industrial times. People brought in food, whether they were hunting or gathering, and they just dispersed it amongst their tribe or whoever.
And do you think that our civilization is better off or worse off than the era you're referencing?
Now,
we can talk about it more in depth later, because we got time for one more question, and then I wanted to wrap up. What's your thing?
I just wanted to add, there is this matchup principle in Bible, right? Those who have more will be given to them, and those who have nothing, more will be taken from them. Mm-hmm. So that was true in the hunter-gatherer times too. Like those who used to hunt, they used to get more. Like those who were capable of hunting. It's the same principle here. Those who are pursuing the careers that are better, they're rewarded that way. So it's more of a personal choice.
for the people in the group to kind of like, say for example, it's just your neighbor is a family member that you're providing food for, or a friend of a family member providing.
So then we can talk, all three of us can talk about that later, but for people who have time commitments, if you have to go somewhere else, is it real quick?
Yeah.
Okay, and after that we got to wrap.
Just like a devil's advocate, I don't know. Just for the definition for social justice, it said getting what you don't deserve because you're a favorite. But Christ loved us when we were sinners, and when we were his enemies, so we didn't deserve grace, yet we got it. But that's like, I guess that's like different. It's like, it just depends on the lens you're looking at.
Yeah, we can talk about that as well. So keep your questions so that we can talk about more in depth. But after that, that should wrap up the Q&A. If you have to get going, I understand. Thank you so much for attending. And yes, that concludes the How I Became Unwoke series. Thank you.